You have been told the Garden of Eden is a place, 4 rivers, a specific geography, a location you could theoretically find if you had the right map and the right shovel. That reading is not wrong, but it is standing on the surface of something much deeper. The word Eden itself gives the first hint. In Hebrew, it does not mean paradise in the way you imagine. It does not mean a perfect garden with perfect weather and no mosquitoes. The root word is Edna, which translates to delight, pleasure, or luxury. But there is another layer. The word also carries a sense of a base, a foundation, a place of origin, something that underlies everything else. The garden is not a location on a map. It is the condition from which all experience springs, and that changes everything about what the story means for you today in this life. This is not about religion. It is about a map you have been holding upside down your whole life. Let us start with what most people believe, because that belief structure deserves respect. It is not weak. It is not easy to dismantle. For centuries, theologians, scholars, and ordinary readers have read Genesis as a literal historical account. The Garden of Eden was a real place where Adam and Eve lived, a physical paradise from which they were expelled after disobeying God. The serpent was a real creature who spoke. The tree was a real tree with real fruit. Think about how powerful that interpretation is. It gives you a story of origins, a reason for suffering, a clear moral framework. God created a perfect world. Humans introduced sin. Now we live in a broken world waiting for restoration. The narrative is tidy. It gives you an enemy, the serpent. It gives you a villain, human disobedience. It gives you a solution, redemption, through a future Savior. And for many people, that works. It satisfies the need for a cosmic story that explains why things are the way they are. But here is the problem. The story does not fit that reading, not cleanly, not without forcing pieces. Consider this. If God is omniscient, He knew Adam and Eve would eat the fruit before He placed the tree in the garden. So why put it there? Why create a test? He knows His creatures will fail. The standard answer is free will, but free will does not require a trap. Free will can exist without a single forbidden object planted in the middle of a perfect environment. Consider the serpent. He does not speak like a demon. He speaks like a philosopher. He asks Eve a question, not a threat. Did God really say you cannot eat from any tree in the garden? The serpent does not lie outright. He simply reframes. He says, you will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And here is the part that should stop you completely. The serpent was right. They did not die that day. Their eyes were opened. They did become like God, knowing good and evil. God Himself confirms this later. The man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. So the serpent told the truth, the whole truth, not a deception, a revelation. If you take this story literally, you have a divine being who places a trap, a talking animal who speaks the truth, and a punishment for an act that was prophesied to happen before the foundation of the world. The logic collapses under its own weight, which means either the story is confused or we have been reading it wrong, or maybe, let me step back, maybe it is not that simple. Maybe the story was never intended to be a literal history at all. Maybe it is something far more radical. Maybe it is a psychological archetype. A map of human consciousness encoded in narrative form. If what you are hearing right now is starting to crack something open, stay with this channel. Every video goes one layer deeper. The Hebrew word for Adam is not a name. It is a word that means human, from the earth, the groundling. Adam is not a specific individual. He is every human. The story of Adam is the story of you. The garden is not a lost location. It is a state of consciousness you once knew and have forgotten how to access. Here is where the linguistic forensics begin. The word nachash is translated as serpent, but its root meaning is far more interesting. Nachash can mean to hiss, yes, but it also means to shine, to whisper, to practice divination, to observe carefully, to learn by observation. The serpent is not just a snake. The serpent is the part of consciousness that observes, that questions, that seeks hidden knowledge. The serpent is curiosity itself. In ancient Near Eastern cultures, the serpent was not universally evil. It was often the symbol of wisdom, healing, and transformation. The caduceus, the symbol of modern medicine, is two serpents wrapped around a staff. The serpent was the creature that shed its skin and was reborn. The serpent was the guardian of hidden knowledge. So the story is not about a talking animal. It is about the emergence of self-consciousness in the human mind. The serpent represents the capacity to question authority, to wonder, to examine your own experience. And that capacity, according to the story, is what gets you thrown out of the garden. Now watch what happens when you read the story through this lens. The human is placed in a garden of delight. The garden is a state of consciousness characterized by unity, presence, and immediacy. There is no sense of separate self. The human does not experience shame because there is no one to experience shame. The human does not hide because hiding requires a self that can be seen. The human does not know good and evil because knowing good and evil requires judgment, comparison, and the separation of experience into categories. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is not a literal tree. It is the threshold between two modes of consciousness. One mode is participation, the other mode is observation. In the garden, the human participates in reality directly. There is no distance between the self and what is experienced. The human does not think about the tree. The human is the tree. The human does not see the river. The human is the river. If the garden was a state of pure presence, and the serpent was the emergence of self-awareness, then the fall was not a punishment but a birth, the birth of the observer that now watches your own mind. Subscribe to keep walking through the architecture of your own consciousness with us, because the next story pulls back another layer of what this map actually reveals about you. If something just shifted in how you read the garden, leave a single word that describes that shift. But the serpent offers something, a question. Did God really say? That question is the birth of the observer. Once you ask a question, you step outside the flow. You become aware of yourself asking. You become conscious of your own consciousness. And that is the fall. Not a sin, a transition, a necessary transition. Here is the part most people miss. The word yada in Hebrew means to know, but it is not intellectual knowledge. It is intimate knowledge. It is the same word used for sexual union. Adam knew Eve and she conceived. To know good and evil is not to understand a concept. It is to experience the rupture, the separation, the fragmentation of reality into opposites. And that is exactly what happened. Before the fruit, there was no good and evil. There was just what was. After the fruit, the human mind became a courtroom. Judgment, comparison, shame, fear, the self as a separate entity looking at the world from outside. This is where it gets deeper. Modern neuroscience has identified a network in the brain called the default mode network. When you are not doing anything specific, when your mind is wandering, this network activates. It is the network of self-referential thought, thinking about yourself, your past, your future, your social standing, your fears, your desires. It is the voice in your head that narrates your life. The default mode network is the seat of the ego. It is the part of you that believes it is separate from the rest of reality. When you meditate, when you enter a flow state, when you are completely absorbed in something, the default mode network quiets down. The sense of self diminishes. Time slows. Boundaries dissolve. That is Edenic consciousness, a state where the self is not a problem, a state where you are not constantly judging, planning, worrying, a state where you are simply present. The fall is the activation of the default mode network, the emergence of the narrative self, the voice that says, I could have done better. What will they think? I am not enough. And here is the difficult truth. The story is not about a one-time event. It happens every single day. Every time you become self-conscious, you eat from the tree. Every time you compare yourself to someone else, you taste the fruit. Every time you feel shame, you are wearing a fig leaf. Look at your own life. Have you ever had a moment of pure presence, maybe while watching a sunset, holding a child, listening to music, and then a thought intruded, this is beautiful. I should remember this. And in that moment, the beauty was gone. The observer had arrived. The garden had closed. That is the pattern. Every time. The story of Adam and Eve is not ancient history. It is happening to you right now. The serpent is still whispering, the tree is still in the middle of the garden, and you are still eating the fruit. If this made sense instantly, it is because you already knew. Some people hear this and ignore it. You are not that person. So why did the story get written this way? Why encode a psychological truth in the language of a literal narrative? Because the conscious mind cannot handle the truth directly. It needs a container, a story, a frame that holds the paradox until you are ready to see through it. Joseph Campbell said that myths are public dreams. Dreams are private myths. The Garden of Eden is a dream that the entire culture has been dreaming for 3,000 years. And like any dream, its meaning is not on the surface. It is in the symbols, the emotions, the structure. You do not interpret a dream by taking it literally. You interpret it by asking what it means for the dreamer. So who is the dreamer? You are. The Garden of Eden is your dream, the dream of a lost paradise, the dream of a time before self-consciousness, the dream of a reunion with something you have forgotten. And that is where the reconciliation happens. The literal reading and the psychological reading are not enemies. They are two sides of the same coin. The literal reading preserves the story. It keeps it alive across centuries. It gives people a container for the mystery. Without the literal reading, the story might have been lost. Without the serpent, the tree, the fruit, the garden, the psychological truth would have no anchor. But the psychological reading gives the story its power. It transforms it from ancient history into immediate experience. The garden is not in the past, it is in the present. The expulsion is not something that happened to your ancestors. It is something that happens to you every time you create a self and identify with it. The paradox is the teaching. The story is true, not because it happened in history, but because it happens in every human consciousness. It is true in the way that a dream is true. It is true in the way that a mathematical formula is true. It describes the structure of reality as it is experienced. Drop "I'm awake" in the comments. Tell me what city you are watching from. Carl Jung spent decades studying the symbols of the Bible as expressions of the collective unconscious. He said that the story of Adam and Eve is the story of the development of consciousness itself. The serpent is the bringer of light, the Luciferian principle that brings knowledge and also brings suffering. The expulsion is the necessary price of individuation. You cannot become yourself without leaving the garden. The garden is the womb. The garden is the state of undifferentiated unity. It is the experience of the infant before the ego forms. It is beautiful and safe, but it is also unconscious. You cannot know yourself in the garden. The garden is the state before separation, and you cannot return to it by going backward. You can only return by going through. There is a tradition in Jewish mysticism, in Kabbalah, that says the tree of knowledge and the tree of life were actually the same tree. One tree, two aspects, the tree you can see and the tree you cannot. The fruit of the tree of life gave immortality, but the fruit of the tree of knowledge gave the knowledge of mortality. They are the same fruit, seen from different sides. Think about that. The same act that makes you mortal also makes you conscious of mortality. The same act that separates you from God also gives you the capacity to seek God consciously. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot have self-consciousness without the awareness of death. You cannot have the knowledge of good without the knowledge of evil. They are the same knowledge. This is why the story places the tree in the center. Not because God is setting a trap, but because the center is where everything meets. The center is where the paradox lives. The garden is the center of consciousness. The tree is the center of the garden. And at the center of the center is the knowledge that you are separate and you are not separate. You are alone and you are never alone. You are mortal and you are eternal. The story does not resolve this. It cannot, because the resolution is not in the story. The resolution is in you. Here's what nobody tells you about the cherubim at the eastern gate. The cherubim are not just guards keeping you out. They are the guardians of the path back in. In ancient Near Eastern iconography, cherubim were placed at the entrances of temples and palaces. They marked the threshold between the profane and the sacred. They were not bouncers, they were doorways. You just had to know how to enter. The flaming sword that turns every direction. The word used is lahat, which means to blaze, to burn, but also to be in motion. A sword that moves constantly, that cannot be pinned down. That is never the same. That is the challenge. You cannot enter the garden the same way you left it. You cannot return to innocence after experience. You cannot unlearn what you have learned. You have to find another way. If you just felt the shift, the moment the cherubim stopped being guards and became doorways, subscribe to keep walking through these stories with us, because what lies beyond that gate changes everything you thought you knew about the path forward. Drop "I'm awake" in the comments and tell me what city you are watching from. London, Lagos, Sao Paulo, Seoul, Cairo, Los Angeles. Because this recognition is happening simultaneously across the whole map right now. And I want to see exactly where the garden is opening up again. And that other way is the entire journey of human consciousness. The rest of the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, is the story of that journey. The calling of Abraham is the beginning of a new relationship with the divine, one based not on innocence, but on faith. The law of Moses is the attempt to create structure in a world that has fallen apart. The prophets are the voice that calls you back to the truth you have forgotten. The crucifixion is the ultimate experience of separation. The resurrection is the return. But here is the part that changes everything. The return is not to the garden. The return is through the garden into something else entirely. Revelation describes a new Jerusalem coming down from heaven. Not a garden, a city with a tree of life in its center, whose leaves are for the healing of the nations. The garden was the beginning. The city is the end, and between them is every human life. So where does that leave you? Right now, in this moment, reading these words. You have already left the garden. You have already eaten the fruit. You cannot uneat it. You cannot become innocent again, but you can become conscious. You can become aware of the pattern. You can see the serpent for what it is, not an enemy, but a teacher. You can see the tree for what it is, not a trap, but an invitation. You can see the garden for what it is, not a lost place, but a state you can access through presence, through awareness, through the dissolution of the self that believes it is separate. The story of the Garden of Eden is not a story about sin. It is a story about becoming conscious, becoming human, becoming aware of your own awareness, and suffering the consequences of that awareness. But suffering is not the end. The story does not end with the expulsion. It ends with the promise that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent, that the one who was bitten will defeat the one who bit, that the knowledge that wounded you will also heal you. And that brings us to the next question. If the garden is inside you, what about the tree? If the serpent is part of your own mind, what does it mean to crush its head? We will answer that next. Remember the question we started with. You have been told the Garden of Eden is a place. What if it is not a place at all? Now you know it is a consciousness you lost, and the only way back is through. The garden was never lost. You only forgot how to see it, and once you see it, you do not go back. Wait. There is something else about that sword, something most people never consider. The word lahat also appears in another place in the Hebrew Scriptures, in the book of Exodus, when the bush is burning but not consumed. The same word, lahat, describes the flame, a flame that does not destroy, a flame that reveals. The cherubim sword is not a weapon. It is a flame, and that flame is consciousness itself. You see, the garden is not guarded by something outside you. It is guarded by your own awareness. The very thing that expelled you is the thing that keeps you out. Your self-consciousness, your ego, your sense of being a separate self, looking at the garden from the outside. That is the flaming sword. It burns every time you try to re-enter by pretending you are innocent. It turns every direction every time you try to sneak back in by denying what you have learned. The path back is not through forgetting. It is through remembering, not through ignorance, through wisdom, not through becoming less conscious, through becoming more conscious, so conscious that consciousness itself turns around and sees its own source. This is where the depth psychologists meet the mystics. Ion McGilchrist, the psychiatrist and philosopher, has spent decades studying the divided brain. His argument is that the left hemisphere of the brain reduces reality to categories, parts, abstractions. It sees the world as something to be used, manipulated, controlled. The right hemisphere sees the world as something to be experienced, something alive, something that is always more than your concept of it. Now watch what happens when you apply this to Eden. The left hemisphere is the tree of knowledge. It breaks reality into good and evil, right and wrong, self and other. It is the voice that says, I know. The right hemisphere is the tree of life. It experiences reality directly, without judgment. It is the voice that says, I am. The fall is the dominance of the left hemisphere, the usurpation of the whole by the part, the reduction of mystery to information. And the restoration, the return to Eden, is the reintegration of the two hemispheres, not the destruction of the left, but its return to service. The knowledge serves the life. The observer serves the participant. And that is the teaching of the entire Bible, hidden in plain sight done in the first 3 chapters. The law, the prophets, the wisdom literature, the Gospels, the letters, the Revelation. Every single book is a variation on this theme. How do you integrate knowledge with life? How do you honor the intellect without losing the soul? How do you know without killing what you know? There is a reason Jesus says, unless you become like a little child, you cannot enter the kingdom. Not childish, childlike. The child who has not yet learned to divide the world into good and evil, the child who experiences wonder without needing to explain it, the child who trusts before she analyzes. But here is the dangerous part. You cannot become a child again by pretending you are one. You cannot unlearn the knowledge. You can only integrate it so deeply that it no longer controls you. You can only know so completely that knowing becomes a kind of not knowing. Antonio Damasio, the neuroscientist who studies consciousness, has written about what he calls the primordial feeling. It is the background sense of being alive that exists before any specific emotion, before any thought, before any self. It is the feeling that you exist. That is the garden. That is the state before the tree. And Damasio says this primordial feeling never goes away. It is always there, underneath the noise of the self. You just stop noticing it. Think about that. The garden is not lost. It is simply forgotten. It is the background of your own awareness. You are standing in it right now, but you are looking at the tree, at the fruit, at the serpent, at your own reflection, at the world, at your problems, at your past, at your future. And the garden is still there, underneath everything, waiting for you to stop looking elsewhere and simply be present where you already are. This is what the mystics mean by the unitive state. This is what Meister Eckhart called the ground of the soul. This is what the Buddha called nirvana. This is what the Zen masters call beginner's mind. It is not a new state. It is the original state, the state you had before you knew you had a self, the state you still have but have learned to ignore. The Garden of Eden is not a consciousness you lost. It is a consciousness you forgot you still have. And this brings us to the most difficult part of the teaching, the part that makes people uncomfortable, the part that sounds like heresy but is actually the key. The serpent did not lie. Read the story again. God says, "In the day you eat of it, you will surely die." The serpent says, "You will not surely die. For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Who was right? Adam and Eve ate the fruit. They did not die physically. Adam lived for another 930 years according to the text. Their eyes were opened. They became like God in one specific way. They could judge between good and evil. The serpent was telling the truth. The threat of immediate death was not a literal prediction. It was a description of what would be lost. And what was lost was not life. It was the sense of being fully alive, the sense of being part of something larger than yourself, the sense of being connected to the source. The serpent spoke the truth, and that is the most unsettling part of the entire story. The voice that tempts you to leave the garden is the voice of truth. The voice that says, "You can know more," is not lying. You can know more. But knowing more costs you the ability to be fully present in the state before knowledge. Now pay attention to this. The same God who said, "Do not eat," is the same God who later says, "Be holy as I am holy." Holiness is wholeness. Wholeness is the integration of knowledge and life. The command not to eat was not a prohibition. It was a protection a protection against a knowledge that the human mind was not yet ready to hold without being destroyed by it. But the human mind, being what it is, chose knowledge anyway. And so the story becomes a story of education, not punishment. The exile is not a punishment. It is a curriculum. You were not thrown out of the garden because you sinned. You were sent out because there was something you needed to learn that could not be learned inside the garden. You had to know what it meant to be separate before you could choose to be united. You had to know what it meant to be lost before you could find the way back. And this is where the personal mirror comes in. Have you ever felt that you lost something you never really had? Have you ever felt a longing for a home you have never visited? Have you ever sensed that there is a version of yourself that you have not yet become, but that is somehow more real than the one you are now? That is the memory of the garden. That is the trace of Edenic consciousness still vibrating in your soul. The Church Fathers called it the memory of God. The Sufis call it the primordial covenant. The psychologists call it the yearning for the mother, for the return to the undifferentiated state. But it is not regression, it is progression. You do not return to the womb, you return to the source. And the source is not behind you, it is ahead of you. It is the state you are moving toward, not the state you left behind. Every life is a spiral. You pass the same points again and again, but at different levels. You leave the garden, you learn the lessons of separation, you suffer, you struggle, you grow. And then, if you are lucky, you begin to see the pattern. You begin to recognize the garden in moments of grace, a sunset, a piece of music, the eyes of someone you love, a silence that feels like home. And in those moments, you know that the garden was never gone. It was just hidden. Hidden by the noise of your own mind. Hidden by the judgments of the tree. Hidden by the flaming sword of your own self-consciousness. And if you have ever felt that quiet ache, the one that tells you there is more to this story than you were taught, then this is the moment to lock in. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next, because the fire that blocks the way is about to become the light that leads you home. But first, leave a word in the comments. Drop "I'm awake" and tell me what city you are watching from. London, Lagos, Sao Paulo, Seoul, Cairo, Los Angeles. I want to see where this longing is waking up in this moment. But the sword is also a flame, and a flame can become a guide, a flame in the wilderness, a pillar of fire by night. The same fire that blocks the way is the fire that leads you through the desert. The same consciousness that separates you from Eden is the consciousness that will lead you to the New Jerusalem. You have felt this. You have stood at the edge of your own awareness and felt something pulling you deeper. You have tasted the fruit of knowledge and found it bitter and sweet. You have worn the fig leaf of shame and felt the inadequacy of your own disguises. You have heard the voice of God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and you have hidden. But here is what changes everything. The voice does not stop calling. The question is still asked, where are you? Not as a judgment, as an invitation. A call to come out of hiding, a call to stop pretending you are something other than what you are. A call to stop covering your nakedness with stories about who you think you should be. A call to stand before the source of your own being and say, "Here I am." And when you do, something shifts. The flaming sword becomes a doorway. The cherubim become guides. The garden opens from the inside, not as a place you enter, but as a state you recognize, a state you were always in, a state you forgot you never left. The Garden of Eden is a consciousness you lost, and you lose it every day, but you can find it again, not once, 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times. Every time you stop judging and start being, every time you let go of the need to know and simply be with what is, every time you drop the story of who you think you are and touch the ground of who you actually are. That is the return. That is the garden. That is the consciousness that was never lost, only hidden. And once you see it, you do not go back, not because you have arrived, but because you now know the way. And the way is not outward, it is inward. The way is not backward, it is forward. The way is not through belief, it is through being. The story ends with the promise, and the promise is that the knowledge that wounded you will also heal you. The serpent that tempted you will be crushed by your own offspring. The consciousness that separated you will integrate you. The tree that killed you will become the tree of life. And that is the whole Bible. That is the entire map. A journey from garden to city, from innocence to wisdom, from unconscious unity to conscious reunion. A journey you are on right now, whether you know it or not. The garden is inside you. The tree is inside you. The serpent is inside you. And the way back is also inside you, not as a place to find, but as a state to remember, a state to choose, a state to become. What started as a question about a garden ended as a discovery about the architecture of your own mind. The garden was never lost. You only forgot how to see it. And once you see it, you do not go back. YouTube video description, short format. You've been told the Garden of Eden is a lost place. What if it's a lost state of consciousness instead? This video decodes the Genesis story through original Hebrew text, modern neuroscience, and depth psychology, revealing the garden as the mind before the self, the serpent as the birth of awareness, final direction. Each movement contains the seed of its own return, and that return is not a punishment, it is a maturation. The Garden of Eden is a consciousness you lost. But here is the truth that changes everything. You cannot lose something that is the ground of your own being. You can only forget it, and what is forgotten can be remembered. What is buried can be uncovered. What is hidden can be revealed. The way back is not through belief. It is through attention, not through doctrine. Through presence, not through reciting the correct words. Through becoming still enough to hear the word that was spoken before any words existed. You are standing in the garden right now. The trees are around you. The river is flowing through you. The serpent is coiled at the base of your own spine, waiting to be lifted. The cherubim are at the gate of your own perception, turning every direction, guarding a door that only opens from the inside. The only thing keeping you out is the belief that you are outside, and that belief can be released, not by force, not by effort, not by trying harder to be good or spiritual or enlightened, but by simply noticing that the one who believes they are outside is itself a thought, noticing that the one who longs for return is itself a story, noticing that the awareness in which all of this appears has never left the garden, has never been anywhere else. That awareness is you, not the story of you, not the history of you, not the image of you that you have spent a lifetime constructing and defending and repairing. The awareness that witnesses all of that. The awareness that was present before your first memory and will be present after your last breath. That awareness never left Eden. That awareness is Eden. And when you rest in that awareness, even for a moment, you are no longer expelled. You are no longer hiding. You are no longer wearing fig leaves of shame and pretending to be something you are not. You are simply there, at home, in the garden, present before the presence that has always been present. The sword is still there, but now it is not a barrier. It is a purification. It burns away everything that is not real. It turns every direction, but now you see that every direction leads to the same center. The center is everywhere. The garden is all there is. You have been told the Garden of Eden is a place. It is not a place. It is a consciousness you lost. And the only way back is through the fire, through the knowledge, through the serpent, through the wound, through the death of the one you thought you were. And when you come through, you are not the same. But you are more yourself than you have ever been, more alive, more awake, more present than you knew was possible. The garden was never lost. You only forgot how to see it. And now you remember.